Tick, of the recently rebranded YouTube channel Tick History, just released a video attempting to clarify his position on the public ownership of corporations. This is part of an excellent series of videos where he tries to explain the scope of state power and how publicly traded corporations are in fact socialist entities. He is challenged on this point repeatedly and so tries to state his case here more clearly, but still manages to get it wrong in a seemingly small but vital way. Let's dig in.
I said in the public versus private video that when a private family gets larger, it becomes part of the public sector. People then asked, okay, when does this transition happen? At what number of people does it happen? Like, if a group of 50 people is classed as private, is a group of 51 people public? When's the cutoff point? Is there a cutoff point?
If you haven't watched his video, or if you are just unfamiliar with his work, you would do well to go and have a watch. Tick is always thoughtful and well researched on his topics of discussion, whether they be banks or tanks. Those books behind him are not just for show. He takes great care to lay out both his definitions and his sources. This is a great help to us when it's time to show where he goes wrong during this debate, and spoiler, he already has. Though it may be a bit unfair, I led with a clip closer to his conclusion. There he makes a case that it is the size, the scope, and scale of the business which transitions it from a private to a public ownership. In a sense, this is correct, as we'll see, but it is incorrect at a critical point, leaving a gap in our understanding. But to close that gap, we'll first have to be on the same page regarding what public ownership actually means.
Well, in my public versus private video, I explained that the public sector is the state. I explained what the public sector was, a societal hierarchy, or a hierarchy of society. I explained that there were numerous synonyms for this structure, from a group to a nation to a society to a public to a worker collective, etc. But what I didn't say was that the mere existence of a state meant that it was socialism. People took what I said to mean that, but I made it clear, or at least I thought I did, that the definition of socialism was the public ownership or control of the means of production.
This is correct. Whether you reach for Marxist, Leninist, or fascist economic theory, all will demand the workers, the people, take control of the means of production. A dictatorship of the people, through unions, through councils, or through some other governing body, all acting as state power. And while the different socialist camps have different takes on how to come into power, Marx, for example, calls for violent revolution and genocide, whereas the Italians took power through fiery, mostly peaceful elections, all of the socialist ideologies seek to use the state's monopoly on force to control the means of production. The public controls production for the benefit of society. In the end, this is just a fancy way of saying the people use weaponry to enrich themselves via the state's monopoly on force. Or at least that's a socialist selling point. In practice, the wealth concentrates around the public officials and not the public on whose behalf they claim to act. The important distinction to draw here is state control, government control of production is socialism regardless of the stated intent or the practical outcome. Just bear that in mind as we draw a distinction between private and public ownership of business.
Forgive me if you've changed your mind on this, but I've heard you define a private business as owned by an individual or a family, and that's it. Which political theorists are there who would define Apple or Tesla as a publicly owned business because it's publicly traded? Okay.
The absurdity of the language we are forced to use here is on full display as people question whether being publicly owned really means being owned by the public. This is also where we start to come back to our original problem, whether a business is state-owned based solely on its size. Whether that be the number of employees or number of owners, Tick's position is that ownership by a social group, by definition, makes that ownership socialist. Therefore, public corporations are socialist entities. But is this really the case?
They are means of production that are publicly owned, therefore are democratic and socialist. They're not private. By society's own rules, once they're on the stock exchange, they're no longer private. They've evolved or leveled up from private to public and have thus become mini states in themselves.
The hallmark of state ownership was control of the means of production. If one man owns and runs his own business, we say that it is privately owned and operated. If he sells ownership of one half of his business to his two neighbors, does the state control it? If he instead sells ownership of one half of his business to 100 members of his church, is that then state ownership of the means of production? Do we now have a conflict of interest between church and state? No. There is a point to be made here regarding the method of administration. After all, how do 101 business owners decide the course and conduct of their business without their business going to the dogs? Sorry. Tick likens the necessary administrative force to a body politic, a mini-state, and in this sense, he is correct. But while voting between 101 members may parallel a state function, that does not grant the company any new authority, any more power than if only 3 people were voting. Let's have an example. Here, we have a business that has been divided into 3 equal shares for each partner, Tick, Extremist, and our neighbor, N. Each share has certain powers within the company, and the company itself also has certain powers. We can price our products, choose where to do business, whom to hire, even giving some of our employees the power to direct other employees. It's a private enterprise between us. No state powers or authority were granted or invoked. But we're old, we're bald, and we're only getting balder. Our neighbor wants out. Whether he splits his share in between his 2 sons, or splits his share 33 times and sells them off to the highest bidder, does not change what in portion of the company may do. It is still only entitled to its own portion of the profit, its own portion of the decision making. Just because there are more people and more votes contained within N does not grant them the ability to take the profit due to Tick and redirect it according to their own desires. They are, of course, free to do whatsoever they will with what portion N people own, but that's not any different from what you can do with any other private business. Nor does it change what the company can do in the market. Having more owners does not give you additional power over your competition. The business has not functionally changed even if meetings between owners become more chaotic and shouty. Partial ownership of an enterprise by any number of people is not the same as state ownership of that production. Or is it? Instead of looking at any number on the small scale, let's use that test on an absurd scale. What if everyone in the world owned precisely 1 share of Amazon stock? Wouldn't that be social ownership of the means of production? After all, the company would now be wholly owned by society. Social ownership of production is fulfilled, so naturally, state ownership is included by definition, right? Well, no. In this scenario, we haven't changed the scope of Amazon's operations, haven't changed its powers, nor its responsibilities. It runs its daily operations just the same as before. It pays its owners their portion of the profit just the same as before. The owners themselves have no new power, no new authority over or through Amazon just because they became more numerous. Shareholders lack the authority to take each other's profits, and Amazon itself lacks the authority to take up arms and send police forces to shut down its competition. Governments can do that. But the 7 billion owners acting through Amazon cannot, because the only thing we changed was the number of people holding a share in the company. The power those shares hold and the things they can do with that power have not changed. The powers that do exist have simply been diluted across more bodies. Whether 7 people or 7 billions of people vote on how to conduct Amazon's operations, this is merely an administrative parallel and not an analog of the state or its power. This is confusing because we are dealing with terms like ownership with a group that has set out with the elimination of ownership and property as a stated aim. How they are using these terms to frame their interests is different than how people commonly use and understand them. You can see this in how profit would be ideally divided. This is because the objective of the business owner, the shareholder, is different from that of a socialist. Between owners, this is easy. Each owns some portion of the company and profits are divided accordingly. If you own half the company, you receive half the profit. That won't do for the socialists. Their intent when taking control is to exert power, to use force, violence if necessary, to skew the distribution in a way that does not reflect ownership, to distribute the results of production in a way that does not reflect the effort, the energy, knowledge, and skill, labor, or time put into the endeavor, to redistribute the output according to their own impressions of who is deserving, even or especially against the will of anyone else involved. To accomplish this requires not just a share of ownership, but force one can bring to bear against ownership, a force that individuals may not justly use against one another. In any other context, we would recognize this as embezzlement, or as fraud, or as robbery. Yet the socialist feels justified in using the power of the state to act as their proxy to make this happen. This is an anathema to proper Western liberalism, what we must needs call classic liberalism. At the heart of liberal philosophy is the notion that government derives its power from the governed, that the state is a mere proxy for the power that people are naturally born with, that if an action is unjust for one person to do to another person, it is also unjust for the state to do. The state has no special privileges, no divine right. It simply acts as a neutral third party exercising our power that we grant to it. In this manner, the means justify the end result. Quite the opposite of socialism, where the ends justify any means necessary. And opposing that is extremist. Okay. So then, businesses owned by multiple people lack the power, the authority of the state that the socialist needs to accomplish their end goals. And yet, Tick is still correct. Every last publicly traded corporation is an agent of the state. But how can this be? If we accept that the owners deciding how to conduct their business by vote does not make a business a state organ with state powers, then what does? Where is the investiture of power, of state power? And for this, you have to go back to the beginning. To understand, you must ask who birthed the corporations? Who gave birth to this core, this body? The state treats a corporation as its own person, entirely separate from its owners. The corporation is its own entity, a person that can pay taxes, has free speech, and can receive fines and penalties for criminal or civil wrongdoing. The ostensible owner loves this arrangement because it limits the liability faced when that other being, the corporation, chooses to do something wrong. The corporate entity can be bankrupted while leaving the private owner alone. Even its very existence can be taken, its functional life ended, while the owner takes off to a private island. This corporation, this entity, and its power was not created by any private individual. Instead, it is a fraction of the state's own sovereignty broken off, a being birthed into existence by its two parents, the private individual acting in Congress with the public body, the state. In exchange, both parties acquire a measure of control over the resulting corporation's conduct, that is to say, state control, state ownership of the means of production. In this way, the government reaches its hands of control much farther than only Wall Street and only publicly traded corporations. And it's here where the definition that Tick gave us, publicly sold shares in an exchange, meets an important limitation. Remember, the socialist objective is control over all the means of production, not just portions of it. This is why a socialist will show up and shut down children selling water or putting up lemonade stands on a hot summer's day. Private enterprise, private trade, falls outside the scope of their control. You must receive your mother may I slip to be allowed to operate a business. It is through permits, through licensing and incorporation that the state establishes companies and corporations. And through its power and control over that company, a give and take symbiotic relationship where money and influence flow between the corporate body and the body politic. This flow between the supposedly private corporations and the public state inevitably becomes the sole measure of economic success in a socialist state. So long as the socialist system is running, then nobody's obliged. The ruling class will look after you and your petty needs. Keep the system moving and keep the correct nobles in charge, and you will be cared for. If you aren't being cared for enough, then the problem is that the nobles don't have enough ownership, enough control. Once you own nothing, then you will be happy, because the nobles will give you just enough to keep you just happy enough to prevent a revolt. And that's it. The public corporation is not socialist because 3 people or 3,000 people share ownership of it, but because the state is partly responsible for its birth. That the state should use its share of ownership to control, to manipulate the conduct of operations and distribution of production. That the distribution of output should reflect something other than the distribution of input. That we must be allowed to use force to take from others to give to ourselves. As you dig deeper into this mindset, you start to see that it is truly not new. It is not progress. Fundamentally, it is the same mindset that supported feudalism and most other state-dominated societies throughout history. What do you say? Should we take a look? Would it be worth it to uncover this new face of Leviathan? Or did I miss something and Tick was right all along after all? Comments below. Like and share if this was useful. That's all for today. Take care now. You hear?